So what we want to look at now is how we can utilize our router to redirect the user to our not found component, but from within the context of our agent.ts file, so that we can do this for every 404 without needing to throw the response back to the method that called it. And if we go and take a look at the React router documentation, what we're using at the moment is we're wrapping our components, or our app component, or our application I should say, in browser router. And this automatically includes the browser history API inside the browser router. And this is basically a router that automatically adds this history object and passes that down to our components. But what we can also use is the router object itself, or the router component itself, and this is a low-level interface for all the router components. And we are currently using the browser router. But the most common use case for using the low-level router is to synchronize a custom history with a state management library like Redux or MobX. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to create our own history object, as per the example here, and we get the history as a dependency in the React router DOM that we imported earlier. And then what we'll do is pass the history as a property to the router. So let's make this change in our application. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to go to our index.tsx file. And instead of browser router, we're going to import router. And what we're also going to import is create browser history from history. And then what we can do is we can export a const called history, and we'll set this equal to create browser history. And instead of browser router, we'll use router. And we need to pass the history as a property to the router. Now what we should find is that our application is exactly the same. We can still navigate around and click on various links. So let's make sure we haven't broken anything. And if I click on my activities, I should still be able to navigate to the different aspects of the application. And that still works fine. But now we have access to this history that we can then import into our agent.ts file and then use the history.push method to redirect the users to our not found component in the events that we get a 404. So what I'm going to do, instead of throwing this error response, what we can do, and I'll see if I can automatically import this, we should be able to. And what we want is this funny looking auto import from ... and this gets our history in here. It looks a bit weird, and that's because our index.tsx file, if a file is called index.tsx, it doesn't need to be specifically named. So this looks a bit strange, but it is an accurate import in this case. And what we can do is say history.push, and we want to redirect the user to our not found component. And what this means is that in our activity store now, we no longer need to throw this particular error, and we're just going to console.log the error in this case. And inside our activity details, let's just remove this catch statement after our load activity. And what we should find is that if we repeat our behavior, and I'll just refresh the page, and if we repeat the behavior we did before, I'll just pick an activity and change the URL, and we still need to change the URL to a valid GUID at this stage, otherwise we get a different response back from the server that I'll talk about very shortly. And if I attempt to browse to this, then we automatically get returned to our not found page. And in our console, we're getting the 404 not found back from our server. So that's okay, but I did mention that we had to provide a valid GUID in that particular response. And if I click on view, and then let's try and send a request that is not a valid GUID, then we get a different response. We're not handling 400 errors at the moment. But what we're getting here from our API, and if we take a look at this request, and we take a look at the response, then what we're actually getting here is a validation error. Now our API server is smart enough to know what is a GUID and what isn't a GUID, and there's very little point in our API sending a request to our handler if it's not a valid GUID, because it already knows that since our activities have IDs that are GUID, then if it receives a request for something that isn't a GUID, then there's very little point in checking to see if that exists in the database. So what we get back here is a validation error. But I still want to return the users to a not found in this scenario as well. I don't want a 400 response for this. So what we'll take a look at next is how we can handle this and also redirect the user back to the not found page.